What are some worldview ideas embedded in the Batman? Can a Christian actually go see the Batman? I always emailed that question this week. How does Batman compare to other films in the series over time that are also about Batman? Well, we're going to jump into that. My guest today is a friend. He is an author of an excellent book called The Wisdom Pyramid. Brett McCracken is the senior editor at the Gospel Coalition and wrote a fantastic article on thinking theologically about the Batman. So sent him a message. I said, hey, would you join me to kind of unpack this? Instantly said yes. So Brett, really appreciate you coming on. Be willing to have this conversation about the Batman.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, we're gonna jump right in and talk about the film. Those of you watching, we've got a lot of topics we're gonna cover theologically, some apologetics, some cultural, and then if we can squeeze in at the time some questions that we both would love to tackle to help you think Christianly about this. But Brett, I'm curious. Just start kind of on the big picture. What was your initial takeaway from seeing the Batman?
Yeah, I actually went into it with pretty measured expectations. I
Hmm.
didn't think, there's been so many reboots recently and so many superhero movies. They all start to blend together, honestly. So
That's
I
true.
was I've been a big Batman fan over the years, so I was kind of like cautious, like don't want to get too excited. But man, it blew me away. I was totally like compelled from start to finish, which for a 3 hour movie is it's not easy to engage the audience for that long, and I felt so
Hmm.
engaged. And it
Wow.
was what I loved about it is it was so immersive, and we can talk about this more, but for me, when you're in a movie theater and you forget that you're in a movie theater and you're just so much in the world that the movie is building, that's where the magic is with movie going. It's where you're transported kind of in such a deep way to the world of the film that you almost forget you're watching a movie. And one thing that I thought about as I left the theater is I didn't really think about the other Batmans as I watched this movie. Like,
Oh, interesting.
normally I would kind of be comparing and contrasting in my mind, like, okay, how does Robert Pattinson compare to Christian Bale and Michael Keaton and all the Batmans that came before? But it wasn't something that I thought about, and that I think that speaks to how fully immersed I was
Hmm.
in the world. So yeah, I loved it. I would put it up there in not only maybe one of the best Batman movies I've seen, but one of the best like comic book superhero movies I've seen, probably.
Wow, that is quite the endorsement. And we're going to get into unpacking that. By the way, I forgot to say spoiler alert for anybody watching. We're
Yes.
going to talk about some ideas that will not ruin the movie, but just so you know, full ahead, we're going to talk about some of the events that happen that would give you a heads up. So if you don't want to know what happens in the movie, the twists and turns, hit pause, go watch the movie for 3 hours plus, and then come back and join us. Now, when I review a movie, it's interesting. I try to think about my expectations going into it
Yeah.
because so much of our expectations are going to shape whether we enjoy it or not. I've had people review a book of mine and they're like, "What the heck? You didn't offer apologetic answers." I'm like, "Well, this is about methodology, so you're critiquing the wrong thing." So I
Right.
really try to be fair, and I think all of us have different expectations that are going to shape how we process this film. Now,
Yeah.
for me, I had a different take than you did. I still don't know exactly what I think about the film. I want to go back and see it a second time. But as
Yeah.
I walked out, I went with my mom, my mother in law, my wife, my son. Like, we kind of made it a family affair, minus
Hmm.
our 9 year old, by the way. Definitely not old enough to see this
Yeah.
one.
That was a good call.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yes, it's pushing the R barrier, and we'll talk about that, I think. But I walked out, and my son was like, "This is great." And I was like, "I don't know what I think. I'm not
Hmm.
sure. I'm torn." And that's not necessarily criticism because some movies
Yeah.
are flat and simple and easy to criticize, and I know
Yeah.
exactly what I think. This movie is layered and it's
Hmm.
complex, and there's so many approaches to it that it's been in the back of my mind since I saw it. And in some ways, you could argue that that's the mark of a great film.
Yeah.
Kind of like when I saw The Gray, although there's differences, that movie just unsettled me for a
Hmm.
while. And I think the
Hmm.
Batman did that for me. That was kind of my initial take.
Yeah.
Now,
No, I think
go ahead.
I was just gonna say I think that's a good thing. Like, I always like to hear when moviegoers say, "I actually don't know what I think."
Hmm.
because too often we're too quick, like literally in the time it takes to leave the theater and get in our car in the parking lot, you've already like decided, loved it, hated it, and then it's over and you move on. And that just turns the movie into a disposable
Mm.
piece of consumerism, essentially. So it's good that I think you're still wrestling with it and you haven't made up your mind. I wish more of us kind of had that posture towards
Mm.
movies generally.
Mm. So, what do you make of it being called the Batman? I mean, there's a lot of different ways. One, you could say, one take would be that this is just a presumptuous, like, really? Matt Reeves is going to call it the Batman when we have all the other Batman incarnations, including the incredible trilemma by Christopher Nolan. Or
Yep.
the other part, as I thought about, was like maybe he calls it the Batman because he doesn't yet know his identity yet. Is he
Mm,
vengeance? Why does he have these scars underneath the mask? Who is he? So maybe they're calling him that because he doesn't yet have an
mm,
identity of who he really is. Because
mm,
unlike the Ben Affleck Batman, which is, he's in his 40s or 50s and is kind of
mm.
angry and jaded from a life of fighting crime, he is in his second year and he's trying to kind of figure out what does it mean to fight crime. So maybe they called it the Batman because he hasn't figured out his identity yet and he's in process. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting potential interpretation. The the way I kind of have thought about it, and this has kind of been the focus of my review for the Gospel Coalition, actually like focus in on the definite article the as opposed to a Batman or
Right.
just Batman. I'm a grammar nerd, so I pay attention to things like that. Like, why did they choose the? Because, in some ways, calling it a Batman would be more appropriate because there's been
Mm.
so many Batmans. I mean, how many different actors have played Batman? How many reboots have there been? This is just the latest of many. But the fact that Matt Reeves is calling it the Batman is audacious, it's bold, and to me, it's like a refreshing kind of just willingness to just go all in and basically say like this is the
Mm.
definitive portrayal, and we're gonna like take you as the moviegoer fully into this world in a way that makes you not even think about all the other Batmans that you've seen in pop culture history. And for me, that was the experience. Like I mentioned, I didn't think about any of the other Batmans. This film was so just kind of compelled by its own closed universe that it compelled me, and it made me like be like, yeah, I can roll with this
Mm.
as like the Batman. But I think there's also larger like theological, philosophical things related to like our longing for a definitive kind of world. And every reboot, every time you have like a franchise that's rebooted in this way, I think, implicitly we want it to be, we desire it to be the best version yet. We want it to be better than the last Christopher Nolan's version
Mm.
of Gotham, whatever. And I think that speaks to our innate human longing for renewal and kind of new creation. Yeah, I talk about that in my review quite a bit.
That is a really interesting way to approach it. That, when Christopher Nolan wrote this, he didn't have this other amazing trilemma coming before his movie. Although you had the 1989 into the early 90s Batmans that were not as campy as the earlier ones, but
Yep.
had a campy element to them. The
Hmm.
comparison was fresh. He could write a new Batman, but now everybody, about what, a decade plus past the end of
Hmm.
those, is going to inevitably make that comparison. And that's almost true when people ask me, who's your favorite character for Spider Man? I'm like, well, Tobey Maguire in the early 2000s didn't have any example to model himself from. And then
Yep.
Andrew Garfield has one, and then Tom Holland comes along with two examples to compare with, and the development of movies and technology. It's almost not fair to compare him in that fashion. But
Hmm.
you're right. With that said, to call it the Batman is pretty audacious, and this movie, like it or not, is profoundly immersive. And from
Yeah.
the music to the setting to the theme, they invite you into this movie. And as far as I can tell, maybe I missed some Easter eggs. There's not a lot of references back to different incarnations, which would kind of undermine the idea of calling it the Batman, it seems like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a closed kind of world
Hmm.
unto itself, and this is where the contrast with the Spider-Man um, movie that just came out, we can talk about that a little bit, is
Yeah,
so
tell me.
interesting to me because yeah, I discussed this in my review. That is the Spider-Man film was the one other film I thought about as I was processing my thoughts about the Batman, and it was really just a comparison film because that movie, spoiler alert, hopefully everyone watching has seen Spider-Man at this point, but the kind of cool part of that movie, of course, is the interaction of the three actors who played
Right.
the three Spider-Mans that you just mentioned, Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and then Tom Holland. And while that was super fun to watch, and I got a kick out of watching their jokes, it did take me out of that world because it was basically a meta kind of commentary on the movies. Essentially, it was basically saying, we know, audience, we know that this is just the latest
Right.
reboot, and so because we know that, we know that, we're just going to have fun with this. We're going to have these three actors who have portrayed Batman or Spider-Man in different versions. We're just going to roll with that. And while it was fun to watch, I do think it left you with the impression that this is a movie and it's entertaining, whereas the Batman immerses you in that world and actually you start to believe in the realism of that world.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take you out of the
Right.
movie to remind you that it's a movie in the way that the
Mm-hmm.
Spider-Man does. So I think that's interesting. I think and there's a lot of examples of this in Hollywood where movies just kind of play with their artifice and kind of knowingly make jokes about the fact that they're movies. I tend to prefer movies that are
Mm-hmm.
just more earnest in like, yeah, like we want you to believe this is a real world, and we're not going to like rupture kind of the fourth wall, break the fourth wall sort of thing. Um, yeah. So I thought that was an interesting comparison of these two huge box office,
Yeah.
successes, very different approaches, Batman and Spider-Man.
It is interesting. Sometimes the Joker will be painted in the comics in a way that is looking at the reader, acknowledging that the reader is watching this. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very interesting phenomena. At least I remember in the 90s when I was reading comic books more, that phenomena would pop up. Now,
Yep.
one of the things I see some comments here about people talking about is vigilantism, the way of Christianity. How do you think Christianly about this? These are exactly the right questions that we're going to explore. But one other point I want to draw out when you look at Spider-Man No Way Home, it's very interesting themes of like redemption. This idea that the bad guys are bad because something scientifically went wrong. So you fix Dr. Ock by fixing, the tech in the back of him.
Yeah.
And that in the positive of that is like, oh, there is such a thing as redemption and nobody is too far gone. But I also watched that and I thought, have we underestimated the darkness that
Yep.
scripture talks about with human
Yep.
nature? And is it too easy? That's another distinction between those films. Now, we're not going to
For
go,
sure.
we're going to come back to sinfulness in this movie, and maybe we'll do a whole show sometimes comparing and contrasting just the two. That would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But back to the Batman, tell me, what do you think is the central theme of the movie? And I ask that because I teach film review for students, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
at Biola and sometimes high school students. And I tell them, I say, in any good movie, there's one central theme that the whole movie is about. Like Jurassic Park, basically, if you mess with nature, nature will mess with you, right? That's the theme
Yep.
of it. Or Infinity
Yep.
War, the theme is like, to what can we sacrifice a human life? What is real love? What is the real hero? So, what do
Mm-hmm.
you think is the theme of the Batman, the heart of the question that the movie's wrestling with?
Yeah, I would say, in my view, the overarching theme is about renewal. It's about how we achieve renewal in a broken, corrupted, messed up world. The charity, the Wayne Foundation charity, the Project Renewal, that plays a big part
Mm,
in the plot. So that's, I think, significant, the name of that, because it speaks to this theme that like the three central characters in the film, Batman, uh, the Riddler, and Catwoman, each of them wants renewal amidst the corruption, amidst the evil that they have personally been victim to. They
Mm.
want a fresh start. They want renewal. Now each of them goes about it in a different way, and I think the film is really exploring those different ways. There's good ways to achieve renewal, and there's bad ways, and you see the spectrum on display in the film.
It really is interesting. I think it's talking about renewal, like you said, and I think in particular, vengeance as a means of renewal.
Yeah, right.
And you see
Purging what's
this
happened. Yeah,
exactly. Is that the right method to bring about restoration, the right method to bring about peace? What's the strength? What's the weaknesses? Because even the Riddler is bringing a kind of justice. And he
yeah.
even talks about truth and lies, but the way he tries to go about it is
Hmm.
different than Catwoman. That's different than Batman. I think you're right. The movie is inviting us to ask the question, what is the means of justice?
Yeah.
I think that's at the heart of it. Well, let's probe into some of the particulars in this that I think will draw this out more. Certain biblical themes. Let me ask you this first before we go. Whenever I'm watching a movie, I think some Christians watch film and think, how many cuss words are there? How much sexuality is? Just a very shallow critique. I watch a film and I'm asking, apart from just enjoying it and being immersed like you do, where is there an intersection with the Christian worldview? Because even people who make a film, if they don't embrace the Christian worldview, they're made in God's image and live in God's world. So we're going to see this intersection between the Christian worldview and between any film. And I want to watch and draw that out. Is that how you watch film, or are you on a just total different spectrum?
No, I'd say that's very close to how I approach it as well. I'm always looking for the ways that Hollywood secular artists kind of stumble upon
Mm,
biblical truth, by common grace. And what are those intersections, and what are those themes and questions that movies are asking that the Bible also wrestles with and offers answers to, and how can we bring those into conversation? That's, for me as a Christian film critic, that's what I'm trying to do, is kind of engage the questions that these films are asking, but bring in biblical answers, biblical ideas, and see how the film either agrees or undermines what the Bible says.
that's great. You mentioned earlier you wish more people would approach film with an open mind. I wish more Christians would approach film sometimes, not criticizing where it's wrong, but recognizing what is good,
Hmm.
recognizing what we can celebrate, looking for common ground, and then maybe offering a critique
Yeah.
where critique is due. I think it's a
Yep.
charitable way to approach it. Now, there's a bunch of themes we're going to jump through that are so interesting as they intersect with Christian ideas. And one of them is just sinfulness. Like, whenever I watch a film, I'm always asking, what is the portrayal of human nature? Is
Hmm.
this realistic in the way that Scripture says? And I think experience weighs out, where, Mark 7, Jesus says it's out of the heart. Romans 3, no one is good, no one not one. And sometimes post apocalyptic films like The Road and the Book of Eli, when the chips are down,
Hmm.
portray what human nature is so like in
Yeah.
its most just base element. And I think this movie gets at this. In fact,
Yeah.
we see corruption almost everywhere in this film. The
Yeah.
police are corrupt, the district attorney is corrupt,
Hmm.
Batman's own father is at least corrupt to a degree and is making a
Yeah.
mistake.
Yeah.
Batman, you realize at the end, has this moment of redemption where even he had been corrupted in a search for vengeance. But it
Hmm.
almost seems to me that this is about as dark of a portrayal of human nature in Gotham as we've seen in a Batman film. And it reminded me, and I'm really curious if you see it the same way, as I was going back to the flood story in Genesis 6:5, where it
Yeah.
says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Now,
Hmm.
clearly, there's some hyperbole that's taking place. And clearly, in the movie The Batman, it's not quite that far, but it's inching up against it. And
Yeah.
as I thought about that more, I was like, wait a minute. This is right before the flood. And in the end of the movie, what
Hmm.
happens is the entire city gets flooded out. And it's almost saying when corruption has gotten this bad, there's a kind of judgment that has to take place. What do
Yep.
you think about the portrayal of sinfulness and that, analysis of the film?
Yeah, I thought it was refreshing.
Hmm.
I think that it was very honest about the prevalence of gravity, and no character is unscathed by it. It's total depravity, right? To use a theological term, and yeah, and I think the biblical idea of judgment, preceding a renewal, a fresh start, going with the flood, and this kind of purging of a corrupt darkness, so that there can be a fresh start. That's what the Riddler is trying to do. So again, the Riddler, Batman, Catwoman, they all are kind of in agreement that
Mm.
there is a pervasive corruption that is a problem. There is a just total depravity in Gotham that needs to be addressed. It needs to be eradicated. And in order for there to be true renewal and true justice, and true shalom in Gotham, there needs to be something needs to be done about this sin problem that's
Mm.
so pervasive. Each of them is trying to solve that problem, and of course, the Riddler's attempt to solve it is problematic because he ends up becoming corrupt in the process, by
Mm.
killing people and destroying stuff. Batman is trying to do exactly what the Riddler is doing in terms of purging Gotham of its corrupt elements, but he's trying to do it through the means of the law and justice. And he never kills anyone. That's the thing about Batman, right? I don't think you see him kill anyone in the film, um, or maybe you do, but he tries to avoid that. And then
Yeah.
Catwoman is somewhere in between the two. I think she's this gray,
Mm-hmm.
morally gray character who, at various points, she wants to go about justice Batman's way, kind of the above board way, and then at other times she's
Mm-hmm.
tempted to kind of follow the Riddler's path of just like indiscriminate violence against people who have wronged her. So yeah, I think the movie it's great, and in terms of how honest it is about sin, and to go back to the comments about Spider-Man and the the weird way that like evil and villains are, it's minimized almost their evil, or it's psychologized away. And I think that's a problem that I see in a lot of movies today. Like there's this whole redeeming the villain like thing going on in Hollywood, whether it's Cruella, the movie that tries to like sympathize with Cruella DeVille and explain her story,
Right.
or
Right.
or Joker, the like origin story of Joker that came out a few years ago, that basically says like Joker became the Joker because people were mean to him, and he suffered, he was a victim. So I think there's a really problematic thing going on in our world where we can't just call sin sin. It has to be psychologized.
Mm.
It has to be couched in language of trauma and victimization, and um, not that that isn't a part of it, but it's refreshing when a movie is just like, yeah, this is evil, this is corrupt, this is depraved, and it has to be addressed. There has to these people have to be held to account, and that's, I think, there's a moral certainty there that is refreshing.
Yeah, I felt so too. It did not water down the nature
Mm-hmm.
of human sin and how deep it is, and how
Mm-hmm.
many people, even those who are supposed to help us, district attorney, police officers, Batman himself, can get affected by it. That's a very biblical idea that we see wrestling coming up with sin. Now, one of the other ideas that came up in this film that I was thinking about is that although everybody in the film wants a kind of justice, right? Even the Riddler wants
Mm-hmm.
justice. But there's different ways we go about it. And one of our mutual friends, Thaddeus Williams, has a book on social justice. And he kind of
Mm-hmm.
compares a cultural view of justice. He calls social justice side B, with a Christian view, social justice side A. And he says, but nobody says justice boo. Like nobody's against
Right.
justice.
Right.
Everybody wants it. It's written on our human hearts. So we see a movie like this and we're like, yes, come out of the shadows. Yes, get the bad guys. But it also raises the question, which we have to wrestle with: how do we really acquire justice? Are
Mm-hmm.
all means actually just? What is the best means of finding justice? those are the questions we have to really wrestle with. And I think the movie at least minimally raises those.
Yeah, yeah. I think the conflict between Batman and the Riddler in the film
Yes.
is, in some ways, it's a metaphor for the conflicts we're seeing now, exactly on that point you're talking about. Like, if we can agree that injustice is a problem that needs to be addressed, it's really the how do we go about addressing it. That's where we're
Mm.
butting heads. And that's where there's some severe conflicts in our culture. No one is saying that sin isn't real, injustice isn't
Right,
real.
right.
It's just very different approaches, and not to like say that every approach to injustice in our world maps perfectly onto either Batman or the Riddler. I'm not saying that. It's
Right.
just, I think that's an interesting kind of way that the film is timely in today's culture, is it's about the conflict that arises when different visions of seeking justice, collide.
I think that's exactly right. By the way, I see some great comments here from people asking. We will come to the questions as we move through. There's a ton more questions I've got for Brett here to unpack this, but make a mental note, and then when we get towards the end, in caps, write question, and we'll do our best to kind of tackle the questions that you have. Now, one of the huge themes that comes up, of course, in almost any movie in different ways, but certainly in different Batman movies, is vengeance. Now, in this movie, it's not even subtle. Batman calls himself Vengeance, and a part of his transformation is related to vengeance. Now, one of the things I think we like superheroes is that we want justice, and we all know that justice is not met all the time, maybe even not most of the times, through our governmental judicial system, as wonderful as our judicial system is. So in a movie, we love the idea that there's going to be someone like Batman, or maybe even a Spider-Man or a Daredevil, who's gonna go get the bad guy and give him his due, or her due. Yet on the flip side, Scripture does have a lot to say about how we as Christians are supposed to approach vengeance and justice. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, Batman, the whole like Batman is vengeance thing. That's actually one of my criticisms. I feel like it was a bit too
Okay.
a bit too heavy-handed. Like the whole
Mm,
like his name is vengeance, but I mean it's part of the film's. It relates to the whole multiple characters are vying for the claim on real vengeance, right? So Batman is called Vengeance. He seems to own that title, that he's vengeance. But late in the film, one of the Riddler's like henchmen who's in the arena scene, when Batman like is fighting him, he says, "I'm vengeance," right? So multiple characters in the film are laying claim on that identity of being the executor of true justice. Um, but one thing that I noticed in the film that I was pleasantly surprised, because Batman in the comics and in other films can be a bit of a vigilante, right? That's the
mm-hmm.
criticism from a
Mm-hmm.
from a biblical justice point of view. Like, is
Mm-hmm.
that vigilante form of justice really okay? But in this version of his character, he actually works through the channels of government authorities and the police, more than I remember in other
Mm,
versions. Like, he's from the beginning to the end, he and Commissioner Gordon are like working side by side. There really isn't. They don't. The movie doesn't emphasize Batman as this lone wolf arbiter of justice. It seems like he really wants to do things in partnership with the official,
mm.
powers. Now it's complicated by the fact that the official powers in Gotham are villains themselves and corrupt
That's right.
themselves for
That's
the
right.
most part. So a certain degree of, taking it into your own hands is necessary. But he never stops working with Commissioner Gordon, the one good guy in the Gotham Police Department. And I think that's significant, right? If we're going to
Mm.
pursue justice, rather than going it our own way in the way the Riddler does, right? He's a total vigilante. He takes justice completely in his own hands. Batman is choosing to work through the established authorities, and I think that's to his credit.
When you said it at the beginning that when Batman says, "I am vengeance," that was a criticism of yours. Is,
Mhm.
unless I'm mistaken, I think this is the first time we have a voiceover that acts like a narrator in a Batman film where he
Mm.
speaks to us.
Mhm.
And just
Mhm.
one of my cinematic criticisms is if you have to explain something explicitly, you're not showing it within the film itself. Now, I
Yeah.
realize we have to get in the mind of an actor, and there's, ways that storytellers try to get creative. But there were sometimes I felt like, oh, they're telling us too much rather than showing us.
Mhm.
And that was a mild criticism of the film to me, especially his name
Yeah.
Vengeance. Now,
I
oh, go ahead.
I would I agree with you, but I was happy that they only did the voiceover, I think, at the very beginning and the very
Mm,
end.
mm,
I would, because when it started that way, the movie with this voiceover, I was like cringing, like, oh no,
mm.
is this gonna be a, an a little bit of a lazy narrative that's driven by a
Yeah,
voiceover, the whole like tell not show. But thankfully it
yeah,
only happened in the beginning and the end, and to me it was more of like a genre thing, like a film noir. You have that kind of,
sure.
you have that bookend narrator voiceover a lot in old film noir films from the 50s, and I think there was a nod to that more than anything.
That's fair. I agree too that it wasn't too much in the film. I think would have taken away from it. Now you mentioned vengeance and Batman working within the law in this movie as opposed to just being a pure vigilante. As a Christian, it seems like that's a step in the right direction, but doesn't get us all the way there. It still begs the question: should somebody seek justice outside the law? Should
Hmm.
that happen? And of
Hmm.
course, Romans 13, in First Peter, it's very clear that we are to follow the just authorities. And you think about even in Rome, this wasn't exactly a morally upright government at that time. There was some corruption. And Paul is telling the Romans, we're going to be good citizens and we're going to follow. Now, maybe you could make the case when it's utterly corrupt and there's no other possible way,
Hmm.
then you can operate outside the law, which is something like maybe we see with Bonhoeffer, in
Yeah.
that case. I'm not
Yeah.
sure Batman was quite there
Right.
because we should have serious considerations with vigilantes. But that's a fair point I think you're raising to say at least it's not highlighted and praising this go stand alone apart from the police, work with those who are good. That
Hmm.
seems to be a step in the direction that we should care about. And ultimately, we can't forget Deuteronomy 32:35 says, vengeance is the Lord's.
Hmm.
It's the Lord's.
Yeah.
Partly, we like Batman because he's going to get the bad guy in this life. But the
Hmm.
reality is, all of
Hmm.
us are going to live with
Hmm.
unsettled moral debts that we can't get justice with.
Yeah.
And that raised the question if we can't fix them like Batman, how do we live with those wrongs in the present? That's
Hmm.
where a very Christian ethic comes in to me as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that it speaks to how dangerous it is to be so impatient in our longing for justice that we're not satisfied with kind of justice is the Lord's,
Mm,
ultimately. We're like, we're just, so many of us in our world today are not patient enough for that. Like we may, in theory, we're like, yeah, Jesus will come back and he'll like bring everyone to account, but we want justice now and we want to take it into our own hands, and we want, there to be punishment for the people. So yeah, I think that's one of the dynamics that you see in the various approaches to justice. Like
mm,
there's someone like Batman who maybe is more patient because he's patient enough to go through the official channels, and he's patient enough to not just, kill people willy-nilly who anger him, whereas someone like the Riddler is just a little bit more of a live wire, just kind of, isn't exactly patient in his pursuit of justice. He wants to make Gotham pay now. And I think in our world today, that's one of the dangerous dynamics that I see is we're such a fast moving culture. The speed of the internet and social media, it's not conducive to patience. So when something
mm,
happens in our world that riles up the mob, so to speak, and everyone is like so angry about it, like because we're so impatient, we make people pay immediately right? And they're canceled and they're destroyed and their reputations are destroyed. Sometimes before the whole story is known and before all the facts come in. And, there's lots of examples of this that we can talk about, but it's problematic when our zeal and our passion for justice is impatient, because too many things can go wrong when we're quickly trying to like execute justice without going through the kind of patient process.
One of the other themes that jumps up in this right at the beginning is this idea of fearing somebody who's going to judge you. And of course, the movie starts with, in fact, I kind of loved the idea of Batman coming out of the shadows. Although he's more of a bruiser than you might say like a ninja or a bat. So to me, there was a little bit of a disconnect. Like someone who comes out of the shadows is sneaky and sleeky, more like a cat might be. But nonetheless, the idea that Batman is hiding in the shadows, and you see this fear of Batman that they portray so well in this film on the bad guys. So as a result of this fear, it motivates some not to commit certain crimes. As I'm watching this, I had a number of thoughts. One was like, wow, in a city that has become so corrupt and so godless, if they don't fear the Lord, there's got to be somebody else that they fear. And they were not fearing the police department. So Batman takes on that role. But I found myself watching it going, yeah, I want these bad guys to fear this. But then I started thinking, okay, but why do I want them to fear it, but I want to pass for myself, right? Like when I come, sometimes I'm like, oh, I want a camera on that corner where there's a light so people don't speed, where they can get a ticket. But I'm different. I should be able to sneak right through this. This doesn't apply to me. I'm fine. I'm a safe driver. It's for everybody else except for me. So I'm curious just your thoughts how this movie intersects with the fear of the Lord, which is such a central biblical idea that we're told it's the beginning of knowledge and it's the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but it is, it is the beginning of wisdom and a healthy fear of authority, of someone who has the authority and the power to impose justice and punishment is a good thing, right? It's why parents, discipline is important. Otherwise, your kids are just going to run amok and it's going to be chaos unless there's a healthy fear of an authority figure. And this could be a segue into talking about Batman as a Christ figure, which I am not. I don't typically go there. Like I think it's lame a lot of times to try to find Christ figures in every movie, but in this case, to my credit, like it kind of is a little bit on the nose in terms of every time Batman shows up. If you notice, and it's used in expletive, taking the Lord's name in vain sort of way, but the words Jesus Christ are yelled out by various characters when Batman shows up, and you'll notice it. Different characters have that's the first thing they say. Catwoman says it a few times. It's like when Batman shows up out of the shadows, they yell that. And so you could read that as just like, that's just a colloquium profanity that people say when they're, upset. Or it could be an intentional choice on the part of the filmmakers trying to like make that connection between Batman and Jesus Christ as the ultimate arbiter of justice, who should strike fear into people, when he shows up in the midst of our sin and our wrongdoing. For Jesus to suddenly show up, we should be, struck with fear in that moment. So I just thought that was an interesting thing that I observed in the film, and I want to watch it again to kind of pay attention to how many times that is used. Those words are used when Batman shows up. But yeah,
I don't even know exactly what to do. That is a super interesting observation. I remember them saying a few times, and I turned to my son. I'm like, Guy, why are they using the Lord's name in vain? What's the purpose? It's not necessary. And it unsettled me a little bit, but I was like, I need to think about that a little bit more. So I want to see it a second time and see if they're making that argument,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
let's talk about the trajectory of Batman that I think relates to this. Typically, when people think of a Messiah type figure, they're going to think more of Superman, who
Mm-hmm,
has unlimited power, who kind of takes on human flesh. He's from
mm-hmm.
the outside, has a supernatural birth. I mean, he's kind of this outside in hero who's
Yeah.
typically been morally pure. Batman is amongst us and he fights evil, but gets his hands dirty. There's a
Mm-hmm,
sinfulness inside of him. Yet in
mm-hmm.
this film, obviously Jesus as Messiah didn't have sinfulness, but of course other messianic type figures in the scripture are flawed, pointing the way towards the perfect messianic figure. And of course we see that
Yeah,
like in the book of Judges, maybe that comes out.
yeah.
But Batman's on this trajectory, and I thought it was so interesting that he says his name is Vengeance, and then of course the transformation redemption comes at the end that you hinted earlier when he sees one of like the Riddler's henchmen. When he takes the mask off him, he says, "I am Vengeance," and Batman has this moment of like, "Oh my goodness,
Mm-hmm.
if we are both motivated by vengeance,
Yeah.
if I stay on this road, that's what it could lead to."
Mm-hmm,
And what's amazing is he jumps out on this cord that was lighting up, cuts it
mm-hmm,
with a bat signal, and
mm-hmm.
falls into the water almost
Yeah,
as a kind of baptism.
yeah.
And then he, holds this torch, which is like a light, such a biblical
Mm-hmm,
metaphor, and then
mm-hmm.
leads these people as a kind of exodus out of the traps they're in into a kind of freedom.
Yeah,
So I think he clearly is a Messiah
yeah,
type figure. I don't know yet. I got to think about the point you're making that they say
yeah.
that when they see him or not. I don't know. That's fascinating. But let me ask you this. I felt like the redemption at the end for Batman was too quick, and
Mm.
I didn't buy it. Now I know movies have to telescope and do things quickly, and the movie was already 3 hours long.
Yeah,
But to
right.
me, there's a difference between saying vengeance doesn't work and the solution is to help people and
Mm-hmm,
love people and sacrifice myself, which is much more of a Christian theme.
yeah,
Those are different things. So
yeah.
when he hears the guy say vengeance, he realizes, oh, this doesn't work. But then
Mm-hmm,
he magically all of a sudden understands sacrifice himself. I need to
mm-hmm.
lead people out. And I thought it felt, maybe if I watched it again, I would interpret it differently. But it felt too quick to me that he
Mm-hmm,
hadn't earned that. Where did he get this idea? In fact, I even
mm-hmm,
asked in the movie, where does Batman get the idea that he shouldn't kill people? That's such a classic Batman thing. Given how
mm-hmm.
much angst he had and how much
Yeah,
anger and brokenness, that Batman would have killed people,
right.
seemingly to me. So
Yeah.
I think you're right that he's a messianic type figure, but
Mm-hmm.
those are the points that didn't fully make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. It was a jarring, sudden shift at the end to, yeah, kind of compassionate, altruistic, saving the innocents rather than fighting the guilty or exacting vengeance on the guilty. But yeah, I mean, I think, and if we're talking about like echoes of Christ or messianic imagery, like the reality with Jesus is there is this kind of paradox of sorts where he is the Jesus of Revelation who comes on a white horse with a sword, and it's like violent and like, the judge Christ. And then there's also the same Christ who's the Sermon on the Mount, and talks about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek, and the Jesus who didn't slay the
Mm-hmm.
Roman soldiers as they crucified him on the cross. He took it, and he sacrificed himself. So there's, even within the person of Jesus, I think there's room for the range of these different kind of manifestations. And Batman in this film kind of, yeah, is wrestling with which of
Mm-hmm.
those to emphasize in terms of the best way to be a messianic leader of sorts. Yeah, do you focus on the judge, the justice part, or the sacrificial servant part? So yeah, but yeah, I would love to watch it again to think about it through
Yeah,
that lens, because
me too.
yeah, I don't typically like overemphasize the Jesus figure approach to movies, but superhero
Yeah.
movies, I think, lend itself to that. Superman, as you mentioned, and Batman, and even Spider-Man, right? Like
Uh-huh.
has these sacrificial kind of moments, save the world by dying to your own self in a way. So
Well,
yeah.
given that you have, I think, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old and another one on the way in 2 weeks,
Hmm.
good luck finding 3 more hours to see this movie again.
That's very true. Maybe my wife will give me like a little like get out of jail card one night, like go see Batman again, so I can have a little mental health break.
Yeah, so go see Batman to help your sanity and mental health. Got
Hey,
it.
that's what I
Yep.
do. That's what I do. I'm a movie guy.
So
I
do
go to
I,
the movies.
actually.
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I love it. A few more questions for you. I'm curious just your take. On one level, I like when political ideas are embedded into the film if they ask questions and don't preach at me. I feel like some of the earlier Christopher Nolan films, which were coming more out of 9/11, ask questions like the Patriot Act and if so
Mhm.
much power is in one person's hands, which the Patriot Act was about. If you elevate against the Joker, in terms of our foreign policy, is this going to raise the response to us? Like these questions were wedded within the Batman films in a way that I thought was fascinating. This movie shows how much culture has changed. So
Yeah.
in this film, one of the things they weave in is somewhat, I hate to just simply call it this because it can be dismissive, but it can be called woke ideology, certain diversity kind of elements intentionally worked in. And given what DC has done with things like Supergirl and Flash and other shows, I was just really curious where they were going to head. And so the opening scene, interestingly enough, was a group of white kind of henchmen and one black guy attacking an Asian, which there has been talk about this, especially since COVID, in terms of race. There was the scene by Selena where she specifically says, she makes the claim, I forget the wording, but it's like these oppressive white people. And all the bad people in the film were white, so to speak. Now, I'm not even making a judgment whether that's good or bad. That we could talk about that very issue forever. But I know everything in a film is placed there intentionally, and they're trying to advance a certain understanding and methodology tied to what could be called social justice. What are your thoughts as you watch this? And I'm curious because I listened to Ben Shapiro's review and I thought he was going to go off on this, and he's like, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was a sub point, didn't bother me, and moved on, which kind of surprised me. He wasn't more upset. What were your thoughts going into it, and now that you've seen it?
Yeah, I also didn't feel like it was as bad as I was expecting it to be in
Hmm.
that regard. I think I go into big Hollywood studio movies these days expecting it to be kind of cringeworthy with how quote woke it is, in the politics. So maybe because my bar was up here, I was
Sure.
pleasantly surprised that that aspect was fairly subdued. Now, that said, there are some moments where it shows up in the film, and I just think that's just kind of inevitable in today's climate. Like, you just have to expect some degree of that. But for my part, I was not bothered by it, and I think had they taken that and run with it, or really like hammered the nail, in a heavy-handed way, then it would have probably bothered me. But I was mostly okay with it, especially compared to other
Yeah.
movies. Like I was telling you before we came on, like I just saw the Pixar film Turning Red, and that's
Oh.
that's an example of, especially when it's a kids movie and it's super just like politically and
Mm.
culturally advancing a message. There, I feel like it's, yeah, that bothered me more than anything in the Batman did.
I used to watch with my kids the Flash TV show, and there was diverse range of characters on, of course, race and sexuality and age, etc. I never felt like they were preaching at us. They just included different people. In my family, we would
Mm,
talk about it. And I started watching Supergirl with my daughter, and they start preaching about a one character who is a lesbian. And what's
yeah.
interesting about this, Brett, I won't mention him on the air because I don't know if he would want to be mentioned, but an atheist friend of mine, we were sitting down having coffee, and he goes, you know what? I view those topics differently than you do, but that was so shallow, it was preaching at me. I also stopped watching Supergirl, and I thought, well, that is really interesting. So I thought it was fascinating that it included a diverse script, and it makes us ask questions about how people are represented and stereotyped. I
Sure.
just don't want to get preached at. And this movie was as bad as it could be, but it was starting to push that barrier a little bit on one level. Let's maybe go to this question, and we'll take some. I got an email this past week that basically asked, how could a Christian go see the Batman? And there's a couple comments here of people saying I'm not being strong enough condemning the Batman and etc. Let me read you what it said. I'm curious what you think, and I'll give my 2 cents. They said, the reason I'm reaching out to you today is that my oldest son, who's 21, asked my opinion on going to watch the new Batman movie. There's a lot of sensual and sexual material along with the extreme violence and language. I watched a few Batman movies from the 1990s when I was in high school and can recall similar but less severe content back then. My opinion is that there's no good reason to watch those movies. They're not beneficial or harmful, and they do not pass the Philippians 4:8-9 test. Now, you're at the Gospel Coalition of all places, and you did a movie review that was pretty positive. A lot of people could take that like, hey, I'm going to go see the movie. So how would you respond to this concern?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first I would say it's a valid concern, and it's important that we don't, as Christians, just flippantly kind of brush aside any flags that people raise about the appropriateness of movies, because it is something we should all think about. And everything that comes into our hearts and minds affects us, and
That's right.
we have to guard our hearts, because from it flows the springs of life. And so you don't have to convince me of the truth of that. Like, I'm very aware of our media diets affecting us. It's what my book, The Wisdom Pyramid, is all about. That said, I think that there's degrees of appropriateness. It depends a lot on who you are and kind of your thresholds and what kind of triggers you and what causes you to stumble. And for different people, it's different things, and we have to respect that. And but from my vantage point, the main argument that I give for why Christians should see these films and engage them is that millions of people in our world are, and these are movies like this are the cultural narratives of our day, and very little is as widely seen in our world as something like the Batman. And it's important that Christians are tracking with, okay, what messages are there? What does it reveal about where our culture's at, a film like this? And what are audiences who are seeing this film being taught, or how are their worldviews being shaped by these films? So if Christians are just absent from that and are totally like, I'm not even going to like dirty my hands with Hollywood, then it's kind of the blind leading the blind, right? The secular culture is just going to like be mutually reinforcing its secular worldview. And I think there's something to be said for Christians engaging in that in a careful way, right? And there's limits, of course. I don't think that this argument should lead Christians to watch everything and to, have no filter for what movies or TV shows we watch for the sake of understanding the culture. But that's what I would say. I still think, it's not appropriate for everyone. And I put a caveat in all of my movie reviews saying like, this film is not suitable for all Christian viewers, and you should research the content beforehand and determine, for yourself and for your family, whether you think it's appropriate. So you just have to use wisdom. Yeah.
Use wisdom. And by the way, I want to reference again your book, The Wisdom Pyramid. I've told you this, Brett. I think it's fantastic. Thoroughly enjoyed interviewing you. Asked you to send me a copy, and I've been suggesting it to people. It's a practical guide for media, social media. So many of the issues today, just let's slow down and use wisdom to process what's going on in the culture as a Christian. And I think your book nailed that. Sounds like you're saying there's 2 mistakes. One mistake is just to be libertine and have no judgment or no filter and just watch anything. Well, that's foolish because it could affect our worldview. It could tempt us. We could be supporting certain films with our money we don't want to support. On the
Yeah.
flip side is maybe to become legalistic and closed off from ideas where we fail to learn and we fail to be equipped in a way that can actually engage other people within our culture and make a genuine contribution. But finding that balance might look different depending on your age, your spiritual maturity, your experience. And I think that's why Paul talks about milk for some and solid food
Yep.
for others. Now, with that said, one caveat that I would add for people to look at this and say, "God, but the movie is dark." It's pretty dark. I
Yes.
actually wish there was a little bit more comic relief in the film. I think Christopher Nolan at least had some comic relief. I remember when Catwoman like disappears, he turns around, and he's like, "Oh, that's what that feels like." I wasn't belly
Mhm.
rolling, but it was a moment of pause, and then you go on. This movie was just consistent from the music to the
Mhm.
lighting to the shadows. Everything was dark.
Yeah.
But it also, they could have gone like, for example, Logan, that movie, obviously, and
Right.
Wolverine, they could have gone that
Right.
violent. They could have
Yeah.
gone like the Joker. It
Yeah.
could have, even some of the sexuality, like they showed certain things, but it was very reserved
Mhm.
compared to what they could have done to a degree. So I appreciated that they didn't push it as far. Now, as a Christian, I would maybe make the film differently, but probably the
Mhm.
creators are not Christians, so I can at least value some restraint on their part, whether it was for moral reasons or whether it was because they thought the movie would make more money as a PG-13. I don't know the answer to that, but a question that I
Yeah.
ask is, how is the violence portrayed? So
Mhm.
the Bible has pretty graphic portrayal of violence. In fact, I enjoy this podcast called Popcorn Theology, and one of the co-hosts was talking about how the book of Judges is very a kind of a way to understand this movie. And I was like, he's right, because the theme of Judges is, and everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. And you see like Ehud stabbing somebody and just the entrails fall out on the floor. You see with Deborah, you see the spike that goes through somebody's head. You see Jephthah, sacrificing his own daughter. And then at the very end of the book, I mean, just this gritty story of this woman who's just abused and cut up and her body sold. Now, why does Judges do that? I think it's partly because it's showing that sin leads to death. That kind of violence is very different than a violence that says it's okay, it's good, and it's fine. So that's the question we have to ask about the Batman. Is it saying violence is good? Is it using violence in this film almost as a kind of pornography just to get views to shock people? And I don't think the Batman did that. I think it was
No.
making a point somewhat like Judges. I don't want to read too much into it, just showing this is a gritty world, and things have gone really south. How are we going to fix that? So I have less concern
Mhm.
with my kids seeing violence when we see its effects and the
Mhm.
consequences of it than watching a movie where violence feels cool. And it didn't
Yeah.
portray it that way. Even the desire to be Batman, I didn't walk away from that. Like I do with Spider Man, I walk away, I'm like, God, I wish I was Spider Man. I want to swing. This is
Mhm.
awesome because it's a sanitized comic book version. But this movie at the end is like, God, I don't want to be Batman. This is dark and he is
Mhm.
paying a price. So
Mhm.
that's how we look at it. We're pushing towards the time you committed to, so I don't want to take any longer. But any thoughts I missed from your review, your analysis from this film that you wanna highlight, Brett?
No, I mean, I think just to comment on the last little remark about the violence, I think this is in some ways it's the scariest Batman that I've seen. Just the Riddler and
Mm,
the way that he kind of devises, violent mechanisms is scary. But it so much of the violence is actually insinuated or suggested without being shown, and I think that's a mark of a really mature, good filmmaker who
mm,
doesn't rely on the shock and awe of like showing all the blood and gore, but can raise the stakes enough to get you as the audience member sweating a little bit because you're nervous and it's intense, which is a good thing for a film to do, to engage our emotions without actually showing it in a gratuitous way. So I really thought that was one of the strengths of the film, was how it simultaneously was a violent film in terms of what happens in the plot, but not as violent as many films are in terms of what is shown visually on the screen.
Well said. Hey, to those of you watching, if you've been enjoying this, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment. It just helps with the matrix, so other people could follow and see this. I apologize. There's some good questions here, and time got away from me. You can see how much I love superheroes, I love basketball, and I love theology and worldview. And Brett, we got to talk about two of them together, so I just get lost in a conversation. I have so many more questions for you. Brian, great question. I apologize I didn't comment on that. Trevor, wonderful question. We're going to have to do this again in the future. And by the way, if you enjoyed this on my channel, this is the first time I've done kind of a movie review that intersects with theology, apologetics, and culture. Leave a comment and let me know if you want me to do more like this in the future, either myself or with a guest. By the way, Brett, I said your book is fantastic. I mean, it's called The Wisdom Pyramid. The Wisdom Pyramid. It's great for anybody. A wonderful book. I told you I've thought seriously about it, taking a group of students through it. I'm thinking through my books next year, and it's one I'm considering. I think it's excellent. Make sure you also hit subscribe to this channel. We just hit 100,000 subscribers, which is kind of exciting about that. And if you've ever thought about studying apologetics, we have a full distance program at Biola. There's information below. We would love to come alongside and train and equip you. Brett, any other way people can follow you, just Twitter, your ministry, that they should be aware of?
Yeah, I would love for people to pick up the book, The Wisdom Pyramid, or you can read my articles at the Gospel Coalition, my review of the Batman, or anything else that I'm writing about there. So that's how you can connect with me.
Brett, you're awesome. Really appreciate you coming on. To the rest of you,
thanks so much, Don.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'll see the rest of you next week.